to explain on how to start the dismantle process on a Van de Graaf roller. It's mostly found for conveyors, different things like that. First, what you want to do is take the terminal board or the terminal box off. With that, it's 2 set screws on the shaft. So once you take the 2 set screws off, be careful with the leads because they are potted inside the shaft. Set that off to the side, and what you want to do is make sure you drain the oil. There's going to be a couple gallons inside depending on what unit you have. They come in all different sizes. So the non-lead end, you want to tilt that up, pull the plug. There's always one plug in the Van de Graafs, and you'll start to drain the oil. What I like to do is I'll take one bolt out to kind of help let it breathe, so it drains the oil a little bit quicker and it doesn't splash out at you. That'll take up to a couple minutes, and once you're done, there's numerous bolts on the outside of the housing that you want to take out. Everything has brass washers and everything is Loctited because of the amount of oil that's inside of these things. You want to stop the leakage as much as you possibly can. So what I like to do, the shafts are marked for what position that you're going to mount these in the up position. I like to mark the housings and any part that I'm taking off. That way you know that everything is going back correctly. What you want to do, these Van de Graafs have these special seals on both sides to make sure you pull these off very carefully. Some you can get a puller, pull the housing off, remove the seal that way. Some of these ones, like this one, I'll take a torch, warm it up a little bit, and then try to pop it off with the puller. You're gonna, once you get all the bolts out, you should be able to use a couple of pry bars, pry everything out to access the motor. The motor usually sits on one end of the unit. You could either have somebody help you carry this or grab a nice trusty little bench and just carefully set it down and pull it right out. And there's your Van de Graaf, there's your motor, here's your gearbox. Now the real fun begins. How's that? So when you start the dismantle process on the stator and the gearbox, you really want to identify your bearings. The bearings on these units are pretty in particular on what you put in them. Some use NJ type bearings, Max type bearings. You want to be able to identify and locate. What I like to do when I tear these down is I like to mark the outsides of them, so when I set them down I could identify and make sure what type of bearing that I have and what I'm using. With this unit, my gearbox is locked up, so I'm thinking that there's some type of mechanical failure on the gearbox side. With these, it's a little easier to dismantle them through the other end and then work on the gearbox side separately. So we'll start the process and get it going. So when these things are in position, it's mounted here and here. These are stationary, so that way the roller rotates. You have the gear on the one side of the unit which drives everything. Here's your stator housings, and you have to make sure you punch mark all of these, that way everything goes in line when you assemble it. And you really have to be careful. If you look at where the leads go, the leads wrap around the shaft and inserts through, and you have to make sure you either pot silicone. I recommend potting them. Silicone in the oil breaks down after time, to access and give yourself enough length to hook it up on the outside for electrical testing. So when you're starting to dismantle on the motor part of the Van de Graaff, most of these housings, like I said, you could take a torch, warm up the front seal, pull it off. You can grab a dead blow and kind of gently just start tapping on the front housing until the housing comes off. So you have 2 oil seals that go in each housing. So here's one seal that I can pull off for you guys right away. It has a nice rubber O-ring that sits behind it. And then you have another lip seal. As you can tell, it's facing the way that you trap the oil on the inside. So we can knock that off later and start ordering some new parts. So that's one housing. Alright, so when you start to pull the housings and everything off, like I said earlier, you got to really watch out to make sure you seal the leads up. They used a potting compound. That's what I recommend, making sure you're sealing the whole lead into place, because like I said, these things are just covered in oil. You can hammer them out with a chisel. You can use a drill, kind of drill them out a little bit, but just be careful that you're not going to cut into the leads. I mean, if you're going to re-lead it, or if it's a rewind, feel free to do what you got to do to get it out. But this one, like I said, is a mechanical issue, not an electrical issue, so I really don't want to create extra work for myself. So just carefully kind of break that out of there. Sharp chisel, screwdriver, whatever you got to do to pull it out. It's a little tedious, but you have to get those leads out to get the motor apart. So the potting goes in behind the bearing through the center of the shaft and then comes out. So that potting is the whole distance. You have to make sure to break all that out to pull these leads out. Some people get lazy and cut them off. I like to try to save what I have, because there's nothing wrong with it. You keep using it. So I'm having a little open mouth and insert foot moment. So the potting fills the whole entire void. So I gave up on trying to break it all out. I'm actually gonna break down and cut the leads. Oh! So what you're gonna have to do is heat this up and break it all out of there. Re-lead the motor to the same length of what you got. So the leads are either tied down or zip tied down. So you want to cut all that off, open up the leads, that way you can pull them through the housing to pull the whole unit apart. So there's a little collar right here for the seals to ride on that sits in front of the bearing. Make sure you heat this up. You could either pull it with the bearing puller, or fast heat, pull it off before you pull the bearing off. However you want to do it, just make sure you pull these off. Right now I'm going to pull the housing off. And like I said, everything is Loctited, so make sure when you're going back together, you use a thread locker of your choosing. And then make sure you remove the ground wire that's bolted to the housing.
Can you show us that?
So all of them will have a ground wire to the housing on the outside. This is to make sure that your unit is grounded out and you're not walking by and getting zapped by a big old capacitor. So now if we're lucky, we pull this housing right out, feed the leads right through. So there's your stator leads. You can see where they cut them back. Housing number 1. Alright, the Van der Graaf motors, like I said, they have bearings galore in them, so make sure you identify each bearing. So here's the rotor. Here's the other side of the gear. Make sure you monitor, look at all the gear, make sure there's no wear marks or anything like that, broken teeth. These things are pretty expensive, so you want to look at everything. Okay. So what I like to do is put the leads inside the stator.
Did you meg it?
Yes, I already megged it. Always meg it before you start working on it, depending on what company you work for. And then I like to flip it up. That way I have better access to just focusing on the gearbox. And then like I said, I probably went overboard on my marking. But just make sure you mark everything. And as you can tell, this side also has another collar for the seals and then the bearing. So I'll start taking everything off. I have to mark this housing as well to the gearbox chamber, and then I'll start pulling all this apart. I'm hitting it, it's gonna go that way, okay?
Yep.
So you might need some assistance on trying to break some of these bolts free. Like I said, everything is Loctited down. One more, Darren.
No problem, man. I got this.
Cool. Thank you, Darren. So you just want to punch. Like I said, make sure you mark everything. That way you know which way it goes back on. So I'm going to mark this guy before I take it off. Now we'll get some pry bars. We'll start. Everything has a register. Don't be scared of it. Just got to make sure you pop them all off. So as you can tell, they use a lot of Loctite there at the factory. And I'm going to lay it down for you guys so you guys can see the gears. So there's your gears, and then there's all your little tiny bearings. So you want to make sure you grab an engraver, 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1, ABC, however you guys want to do it. Just make sure you guys are marking each one to its shaft before you start replacing bearings and everything. There you go, Jim. I thought that was something, but it's not. So as soon as I took that housing off, this whole thing just freed up. I couldn't move any of these before. See that? Now it rotates. Alright, so I'm gonna mark each gear. Oh, that's okay. Cool. So right now I'm gonna take the housing off to access the next step. All right.
I'm here to help you.
That blue Loctite, man. Some good stuff.
At least it's not red. You'd snap all the bolts. That it?
Yes, sir. That's it. Thank you, Darren. And then there's some more gears. So you can see this side is marked right here, drive in. So you want to be careful when you're pulling these out. Some of them have spacers, some don't. So let's see what happens here. Okay. All right, so there's your spacers. There's your bearing sleeve with your spacers. You always want to be careful. Leave everything kind of set in place. Put everything back on. Proper identify of everything. All right, so next we're gonna wanna take the ring gear off to access the bolts for the housing. So I got my brass punch, good old hammer. Okay. All right, so you wanna get a nice good spot. Couple of good hits. Ring gear comes off. Make sure you identify which way you pulled it off. Now you can take your housing off.
Here we go again. Coming towards me?
Yep.
Crap. That takes a little more force right there.
Yeah.
Time to change batteries. Is that it?
That's it. Thank you, sir.
Absolutely.
Single. Bulletproof. So again, to break the housing from the stator, brass punch. Catch the lip, pop it off. There's your secondary housing.